Welcome. This video is about our science project. We're 8th graders who decided to do a pretty, well, frankly, remarkable project for two young teenagers. We decided to attempt to create silicon-based life. And skip to this if you don't want the explanation.
If you're not already familiar with organic chemistry, I'll give you some background. All organic compounds contain carbon, the so-called building block of life. The reason for this is because of the number of valence electrons, which regulates the amount of bonds an atom can make. Carbon has 4, which just happens to be the number you need to have the most amount of bonds. Now, you might be wondering if there are any other atoms that have 4 valence electrons. It turns out there are. Silicon, that silvery metal used in computer chips, has 4 valence electrons as well as carbon, meaning it can also create silicon bonds to those with carbon. Our goal was to make organic compounds with silicon in place of carbon. Did we expect it to work? Kind of. We were optimistic. That explanation is a little oversimplified, but it works for now. Our goal was to replicate the Miller-Urey experiment as close as possible. The Miller-Urey experiment was an experiment in which two guys named Miller and Urey put some basic chemicals into a flask and then electrocuted it to see if it would make more complex organic compounds, like amino acids, which it did. We were going to do this until reality hit us. The Miller-Urey experiment is essentially what we were trying to do, but with an actual apparatus and attempting to make carbon-based life instead of our silicon stuff. The electricity flowing through the primordial soup facilitated reactions, so the experiment was very successful.
But they were top scientists with an actual budget and years of experience under their belt. Not so much the wide-eyed 13 and 14-year-olds that we are. Granted, this is a pretty remarkable project for some 8th graders. In the end, we produced an odd-looking contraption that looked like it might work. It looked like this. Basically, the electricity would flow in through the plug, go through the wire, jump the gap, and go right back. If you know almost anything about house electronics, you might also know what this green wire is attached directly to the box. It's called a ground wire, and it's essentially a safety precaution. If any stray electricity got out, it would go through the wire and into the ground, into the socket, and the electricity would just cut off. Our experiment was also a huge safety hazard. Safety notwithstanding, we thought it was great, and got shut down. Don't get me wrong, I don't think it was necessarily that safe either, because it's essentially sticking a metal box into a socket, or at least that's close enough to explain it. I understand that my school was just trying to be careful, but it was a little disappointing that 2 weeks worth of work amounted to really not much. On the bright side, I understand house electronics a bit better, so that didn't fly. And if all else fails, kill it with fire. And that's what we did, while the analogy falls apart a little. We used a Bunsen burner. I took 2 videos of our second and third runs. It was basically a Bunsen burner under a bowl with our primordial soup. And did it work?
Nope.
But that's okay, because something really interesting happened anyway. After the first experiment, we did some pH testing in paper chromatography. These are the pH papers of the respective tests. You can see something happened in the first experiment. We'll go over the paper chromatography later. Now, we accidentally also changed some stuff in the first 2 experiments, so we just decided to continue it. Our first experiment, we forgot to use the hydrogen peroxide. Now, our second experiment, we didn't dust the silicon as finely. Our other 2 experiments, we did. Our third experiment, we both dusted the silicon and sterilized the bowl and other instruments, so you might think of this as the control. The red in the first experiment meant that something pretty acidic got produced. That means that something already in the bowl, which got neutralized by the hydrogen peroxide, had a reaction. That reaction created the acidic compound. The pH paper, turning a deep red, could also just be an error. But it's hard to believe that an error would produce that strong of an acid. Since we didn't sterilize the containers at first, it could have been carbon that formed the acid. That was the only difference between the first and third experiment.
So, on to paper chromatography. Now, the 3 experiments look like this. And can you see a difference? If not, well, I don't blame you. Neither could we. The reason for that is because we didn't have the solution we needed to make it look like something, an anhydrate. Because again, it's a middle school lab and we didn't have time. So, in conclusion, it didn't really work. Or rather, if it did, it created something as basic as our original solution and transparent. So, stuff like this. Thanks, Wikipedia, by the way. So, what did we learn? So one thing we learned is that middle school labs probably aren't the best to try and create a new form of life. That was a pretty important lesson.
Given the results of this experiment, it's unlikely that silicon is as good as carbon at forming more complex compound. Proof of this was because when we didn't sterilize and allowed carbon to come in, it formed an acid. When we did, it formed a base. And amino acids are, of course, acids, so it's totally possible an amino acid formed with the carbon, but not with the silicon.
Footnote. Actually, in the first experiment, when we originally did it, it was red, but gradually it denatured. Not sure if you can denature if it's not an organic compound, but if so, it denatured into, well, basic compounds. And that's why you can see the gradient of it going from red to blue, then to green. That greenish part at the end was just because of the vapors coming off of our solution.
Although we might not have produced the result that we had wanted, we still had a fun time, and we've learned a lot about science, and we'll try to do experiments like this in the future.
So goodbye for now, and I guess I'll see you if I make a next video.
The red in the first experiment meant that something pretty acidic got produced. That means that something already in the bowl, which got neutralized by hydrogen peroxide, had a reaction. In turn, that meant we used it the next 2 times. Now, our second experiment, we didn't dust the silicon as finely.
May we have Ryland 2, please?
Okay, repeat that sentence.
Now, our second experiment, we didn't dust the silicon as finely.
Do you know where he is?
Oh, we do not know. Do you know where he is?
No idea.
He's not in Spanish. Hello?
Not there anymore. All right.
Oh, she was there. Okay, fair. Stuff like this. Thank you, Wikipedia, by the way.
We want to redo that because there were people talking in the hall.
Also, the script's done. So we need to write more stuff.
Yeah, let's write more stuff. I'm gonna pause.